Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, let's remove all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts. Now let's go ahead and use a pry bar. We're going to carefully get in between the caliper and the outer pad, and what I'm essentially going to do is just gently pry, and I want to try pushing in the piston as far as I can. Put this in there. Now let's move along to our caliper slider bolts. You're going to find 2 13mm headed bolts. There's one up here and there's one located down here. Go ahead and remove the pair. That one's nice and loose. I'll leave it in there. The next thing you want to do is inspect your caliper. Make sure you don't see any fluid along this area right here. If you do, it's more than likely brake fluid, in which case you'd have to replace the caliper. This one looks good, so I'll set it aside. When I do this, typically it's a good idea to go ahead and hang it in some way. You want to make sure you're not putting any pressure on your flex hose. Now let's go ahead and get our brake pads out of here. Once you have all that out of the way, let's continue on to our 2 caliper bracket bolts. You'll find one here and one right there. Use a 21mm to remove the pair. Set your bracket aside. Next, I'm going to take one of my lug nuts. I'm just going to start it on here, just a couple threads. After that, we want to break the rotor free. Typically, you can just grab onto them, pull them right off. If you can't, let's give it a loving bonk along this area with the hammer. There we are. Remove your rotor. Next, it's going to be time to remove our 32mm axle nut. Let's use a little bit of penetrant in there. And then we'll continue on with a hammer and punch. We're going to come right into the center area here, give this a couple loving bonks. Now that that's broken free, let's continue. Now on the back side of the knuckle, we're going to find 4 15mm headed bolts that hold the wheel bearing to the knuckle. You can see one down here, one directly up above it, and then there's 2 more located on the other side of the knuckle. That one's nice and loose. Push that out of there. Inspect that bolt, set it aside, do the same to the rest. let's go ahead and turn that knuckle. We'll tackle the other side here. Do the top one first. Now that one's out, let's go ahead and follow it down to the lower one here. Keep in mind, this is the last bolt holding the wheel bearing on. Typically, they will be stuck inside the knuckle a little bit, but overall, just be careful so it doesn't fall off and hurt you. The next thing we're going to have to do is take a nice big hammer. We're going to carefully try to hit on this wheel bearing from side to side a little bit just to break it free from the knuckle so we can remove it. You can see it's starting to separate. Go ahead and grab onto that wheel bearing, carefully remove it from the vehicle. There it is, friends. All right, now that the wheel bearing's out of there, let's have a look at the area where the wheel bearing was sitting. As you can tell, there's typically a lot of debris inside this area. Generally, if you just go ahead and try to scrape the majority of it out of there, maybe even use a little brush, you can get the majority out, and that should be good enough. After you get that, you want to make sure you get all along this flat area here where the wheel bearing's supposed to ride. Something to pay close attention to inside this area is your ABS sensor. That comes right through from the outside aspect of the knuckle, right through into this inner portion here. So when you're cleaning, just be very careful not to damage it. After you get everything so it looks like it's adequately cleaned up, go ahead and just put your finger over it, and then we're just going to use some copper never sees around everything else. You can get a little bit on those axle splines. Alright, so now this looks good. Let's continue on to grabbing all of our mounting bolts. We're going to bring them over to a wire wheel, clean up all the threading, and then apply a little bit of red thread locker. Okay, now it's time to install our brand new front wheel bearing. Now for this, let's just have a look at the backside. You can see where it does have the magnet area. Just make sure there isn't any debris stuck to that and it doesn't look like it's damaged in any way. Assuming it looks good, we'll go ahead and turn this right around. We're going to get it right onto the axle here. You can see it sliding through. We'll line up all 4 of those bolt holes, start in all 4 of our bolts, and then we'll tighten them up to manufacturer specification. Sometimes the hardest part is just getting it lined up. Alright, let's bottom these out. Now we're just going to go ahead and bottom out the wheel bearing to the knuckle with these bolts. When I do this, typically I like to go diagonally. So I'll start down at one corner, make my way up to the far corner, and then of course come across and then back down diagonally to the other. Alright. Now that we have all of our mounting bolts tightened down, we can continue on by torquing these to 35 foot-pounds. You don't have to necessarily torque these in any specific order. Alright, now it's going to be time to go ahead and get our axle nut on here. I always like to use a little bit of red thread locker, and typically it's a good idea to replace the nut, but if you're not replacing the nut, you have to at least use some red thread locker. Let's go ahead and bottom this nut out, and then we're going to torque it to 181 foot-pounds. To be able to torque this to the specification, you're going to want to have a nice bar. We're going to go ahead and carefully put it across some of these lug studs to prevent this from spinning. Now we can torque the nut. Now before we can go ahead and put on our rotor, you're going to want to go ahead and clean up the mating surface that's going to go right up against that brand new bearing. I'm going to be replacing the brakes, so I'm not necessarily worried about this, but for you, just go ahead and sand it down. Now let's go ahead and put some copper never sees on our mating surface. Time to install the rotor. I always put one of my lug nuts on here. It's just going to hold the rotor so it can't flop around on us while we continue. Let's go ahead and take that caliper bracket. We're going to get it right into position. After that, we'll take both of our caliper bracket bolts with a little bit of red thread locker. We can start these in, then we'll tighten them up and torque them to manufacturer's specification. Let's torque this to 125 foot-pounds. Okay, now it's going to be time to install our brake pads. Pay attention to this area along here. You're going to find a wear indicator. You want to have one wear indicator on the inner pad facing down. Let's go ahead and take this. We'll slide it into position into the caliper bracket. Now when you put in your brake pads, you want to make sure that you don't have to hammer them in. They should be able to flow around freely just like this. If you have to hammer it in there, more than likely you didn't clean up the bracket enough. Put this in there. Next we're going to move along to talking about the caliper itself. We're going to want to go ahead and squeeze in this piston as far as we can. So I'll just use my caliper tool here. Slide it right into the piston. Start squeezing this in. Once your caliper piston is fully depressed down into the caliper, we're going to continue on with a little bit more of that high temperature grease. And essentially I just want to go right along the caliper piston. And then we're also going to go along each of these ears. This is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Let's go ahead and grab onto that caliper. We'll slide it in position. We want to pay attention to the caliper sliders, make sure that it fits on there. We're going to go ahead and slide this right over the pads and put it in here. Once that's situated, let's continue on with our caliper slider bolts here. Go ahead and bottom those out. Once you have both of these bolts snugged, go ahead and torque each of them to 26 foot-pounds. All right, let's go ahead and get this lug nut off of here so we can grab the wheel. Now we can put the wheel on. At this point, we're going to start on all of our lug nuts. We'll bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we can torque each of the lug nuts in a crisscross manner to 100 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, we got the car back together. What's left to do now? Now you want to make sure you pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm. After that, climb under the hood, double check your master cylinder. That's where the brake fluid is. If it's a little low, go ahead and top it off with some .3 brake fluid. After that, take it for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.